Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jennifer Dorning. I'm the president of the Department for Professional Employees, Afl-Cio, or DPE for short. For those unfamiliar with DPE, we are a coalition of 24 national unions representing more than 4 million professional and technical workers. One of the ways DPE supports professionals and their unions is by conducting research and analysis of different industries and occupations. Today's program originates from our work analyzing the architecture industry and will feature the results from our survey of architectural professionals' work conditions. Then we will hear from newly organized professionals at Bernheimer Architecture, and we'll conclude with a Q&A featuring organizers from the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, or IAMAW for short. Before we begin, let me introduce our speakers. I am joined by DPE's Communications Director, Katie Barrows, who will facilitate today's event, and DPE's Research and Organizing Manager, Alana Steide, who will be presenting the results of our survey of architectural professionals. We're also excited to have Chris Beck and Ann Lay, who are part of the organizing team at Bernheimer Architecture. In late summer, early fall, Chris, Ann, and their colleagues at Bernheimer Architecture became the first employees at a private sector architecture firm to join together in union. Additionally, we are joined by Andrew Daly and David DiMaria from the IAMAW. Andrew and David work on IAMAW's Architectural Workers United campaign, which aims to assist architectural professionals who want to join together in union to improve their industry. Andrew is an architect himself and came to IAMAW after spending 7 years at Shop Architects. Chris and Ann and their colleagues at Bernheimer were supported and guided through the union organizing process by Andrew and David. So now I'm going to turn it over to Katie to provide an overview of union professionals and the state of the architectural industry.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm just going to share my screen for this part. So before we get into the details of the workplace landscape for architecture professionals, I'm going to tell you a little bit about professionals and unions. So currently there are 6.24 million professionals in unions, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And these include those in more than 200 different occupations. For example, scientists at NASA, broadcast crew members at CBS, and musicians at the Met Orchestra are all union professionals. The number of professionals in unions has been increasing overall. And as a segment of the labor movement, for decades. In 2000, there were just under 5 million professional union members, which made up about 30.5% of the labor movement. Today, the 6.24 million professionals in union are 45% of the labor movement. This growth can be partially attributed to recent union organizing by professionals in traditionally unorganized industries and occupations. For example, at nonprofits, by digital journalists, and in tech. One of the key reasons professionals join and form unions is to gain the power to negotiate collectively for better pay and working conditions. In fact, union members earn 19% more on average compared to non-union employees and have substantially better benefits, including lower health insurance premiums and better quality plans, larger retirement contributions, and more paid time off. Union professionals also use their legally protected say to address workplace inequities. For example, union members at NPR secured a provision in their union contract that requires at least 30% of candidates interviewed to be from underrepresented groups. Union professionals have also negotiated for pay equity reviews, salary history bands, and other diversity in hiring provisions to help create more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces. Through their union, professionals have the power to establish and raise standards for their professions. In the nonprofit sector, which is notorious for low pay, union professionals are raising the bar by securing salary minimums that provide a living wage and guaranteed annual raises. For example, union members at the Center for American Progress raised members' salaries by $10,000 on average with their first union contract. In healthcare, union professionals have also used legislative advocacy as well as their contracts to secure staffing minimums that benefit both healthcare professionals and their patients. Additionally, union members have lobbied the government for student debt relief and bargained for contract provisions to assist with student loan repayment. And nonprofit employees, for example, nonprofit employees at Every Texan secured monthly stipends for student loan payments, and nonprofit employees at Northwest Justice Project have a loan repayment program in their union contract. And at DPE, now transitioning to the state of the architectural industry. At DPE, we research different professions and occupations and industries to identify issues affecting professionals and support union organizing. We recently researched the architecture industry and put together a data sheet, which can be found on our website. Some of our findings included that 378,000 professionals were employed in architecture professions in 2020, according to the Census Bureau's current population survey. Private sector architectural jobs are not heavily unionized. The industry lacks diversity, with people of color and women being underrepresented in architectural professions and occupations. Additionally, female architects are paid 18% less than male architects. And just a note, if anyone is curious about the data sheet, again, you can visit it. You can see it on our website at dpeaflcio.org under our fact sheet section. But due to these findings, what we heard from folks in the industry, we knew there were issues, but we wanted to learn more and see if they were of widespread concern among professionals in the industry. So in March, we started conducting a survey of architectural professionals' work conditions. And we got a lot of interesting results. And so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alana, who is going to provide an overview of the results of our survey.
Thanks so much, Katie. So having researched the industry, like Katie said, and identified some issues, DPE developed an online survey to learn more about whether these issues were concerns for architectural professionals. We received about 430 responses from architectural professionals across the country. The survey was non-scientific, which means that it reflects the views of the respondents and only the respondents. So therefore, we advise against extrapolating the data to draw conclusions about broader populations of architectural professionals. Nonetheless, our results were really striking. So one important caveat to the study is that on the whole, some of the racial demographics of our sample were unrepresentative of the national data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics on races employed in specific industries. For example, we noticed that women identifying respondents were slightly overrepresented in our survey, as were those who identified as Hispanic or Latinx. There was a significantly underrepresented sample of Black or African American respondents. However, respondents who identified as Asian did reflect the national data. Lastly, the sample skewed younger, which might be indicative of a trend among architectural professionals to leave the field after about 10 years. So with that, now I'll discuss the survey results. So first, when asked how likely respondents were to recommend joining the architectural profession to others, a majority, about 66%, said that they would caution against it. So this raised alarm bells for us, like why might so many architectural professionals advise others against entering the field? So, perhaps something has to change in this industry. More specific data around dissatisfaction with their jobs centered on salary and benefits. So we found that 51% of respondents are dissatisfied with their salaries, and 55% feel either dissatisfied with or neutral about their benefits. The large portion of neutral responses for the latter could be attributed to a sample that's, again, skews younger and may not have like needed to think too deeply about benefits packages yet in their current stage of life. But I'll come back to the question of salaries a little bit later on. Another data point we were struck by was how often respondents said that their scheduled time off was interrupted by work duties. We found that 62% of respondents have their time off interrupted either sometimes or most of the time, and 88% have their time off interrupted at least occasionally. This sort of information implies that the respondents work in an environment that may not respect the needs of its staff, or more generally, that the employer just doesn't take scheduled time off or work-life balance seriously. So now we'll talk a little bit about organizing. So having a say in workplace policies is just one of the many differences a union makes. When employees come together in union to negotiate for better pay, benefits, and working conditions, it means that they have a seat at the table regarding important workplace issues. But often there are obstacles to organizing for better pay, benefits, and working conditions. I mean, it's clear that architectural professionals want change, but they're afraid to speak up. When respondents were asked if they have a voice in policymaking at their firm, 63% said no or only occasionally. Additionally, 55% fear retaliation for speaking out about issues in their firm. Almost 90% of respondents said that they want to see changes to their working conditions, and 83% said that they would approve of a proposal to form a union at their workplace. These are promising numbers for the labor movement, but they need to be followed by action. So in the second portion of this program, you'll hear from architects who took action and organized their workplace. So weekly hours worked was another area of our survey, and it's, as many of you probably know, it's a fraught topic among architectural professionals. Our survey revealed that in a typical week, architectural professionals work an average of 46 hours, while during a deadline week, it increases to about 56 hours. And while 56 hours was the average for a deadline week, we learned that 71% of respondents can work at least 50 hours and as much as over 80 hours in a typical deadline week. A little over half of that 71% are fairly young, between 25 and 36 years old. Sounds pretty unsustainable and could point towards the burnout that some architects feel early on in their careers. Then we asked, what is the most number of hours you've ever worked in a week? 12% of respondents said that they have worked 90 hours or more in 1 week, which is simply put a lot. It really does sound like some of our respondents are being worked to the bone. When asked whether respondents have been told to underreport excessive hours in order to boost project metrics, 46% of respondents said that this has happened at least once in a while, and 18% are told to underreport hours most of the time. It's clear that underreporting of hours is happening far too often. This habit of underreporting not only glosses over, but misrepresents the amount of work that goes into a project. So in the end, employers are like shooting themselves in the foot by doing this just to make it look like a project was completed within a certain and perhaps unrealistic timeline. Okay, so back to compensation. Architectural professionals are notoriously underpaid. The average salary of survey respondents was about $78,000. Though again, keep in mind that our sample skewed a bit younger, and respondents were based across the country, which accounts for variation in pay based on location. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, employers in many industries forced employees to take pay cuts. So the same thing happened in the architectural field, and our survey shows that about 28% of respondents were forced to take a pay cut. We also asked respondents if they were promised a raise before or during the pandemic that didn't end up happening. and about 21% said that they never got the raise they were promised. So in conclusion, the Department for Professional Employees Architectural Professional Survey reveals that a significant majority, 90%, of over 400 respondents want to see change at their workplace, and 83% would approve of a proposal to have a union. Most would caution others against joining the profession, and some are actively looking for other jobs. Instead of quitting, though, you can make your workplace better by joining together in union. It's the best chance that architectural professionals have to improve conditions in the industry, like achieving better pay and a strong, unified voice in the workplace.
Thank you, Alana. Now we're going to turn it over to Chris and Anne, whose union at Bernheimer Architecture was recently voluntarily recognized. For those of you who are unaware or unfamiliar with the union process, in the private sector, when employees join together in union, their union can either be certified through a union election or through management recognizing the union after a majority of employees have demonstrated their support for the union, usually by signing cards, which is known as voluntary recognition. So I'll let Chris and Anne talk about the steps they took to form their union.
Great. Well, I want to really thank the DPE for putting this on. I think this is a really huge step, in kind of solidifying this conversation and getting some data behind what, that sort of at least validates a lot of what we've been feeling, in the architecture community. So, thanks for doing that and organizing this event. So I'll kind of briefly just start by talking about some of the things we did before formally organizing. I think Anne's going to jump off and kind of walk us through what the more formal steps towards unionization. But I think it's important to start with what we did before we were really aware of that this was something we could do, because it as you mentioned, this is the first union that's been formed in almost a century in the private sector. So it's really not a kind of part of, or at least until recently, it really hasn't been a part of the conversation in terms of making better workplaces and architecture. So before the pandemic, something we had started doing was kind of what I called informal organizing in retrospect, but was really having conversations starting kind of at the designer level, which is the lowest level in the office, kind of non-management, right? So we started having conversations in small groups with people who were a little more senior within that non-management title. And we started saying, what are some things that we want to see changed? And more importantly, like, how can we start having conversations about changing the workplace, right? How can we kind of actually make formal changes? Like, we don't really know, how to request things like having a software manager or, increasing our vacation time. How do we even start these conversations? Because so much of what we do is just is sort of either implicit or handed to us, right? We don't really, we get like a handbook and that's it. The conversation kind of ends there. And there's no input into that. So we started having these conversations and then kind of expanded that out, right? And kind of started bringing more people in and say, okay, we're interested in seeing some things change. What is it exactly that you want to change? And so we created a survey and, getting people's priority items on a list, essentially, and kind of trying as democratically as possible to say, okay, what is the list of items we want to see, right? And then we got that list and the set of priorities and kind of then brought that to management in an informal setting. And so that got us some results, so it got some conversations started around some things, but both the pandemic and really the lack of formal structure other than these kind of casual conversations sort of left a lot of these things on the wayside. It's easy to bring these topics up in a kind of non-unionized workplace, but to see them actually implemented and to hold management accountable is really tricky without the structure of a union. So I'll leave it there and let Anne kind of fill us in on what happened next.
Yeah, so I guess I'll take you to after the or during pandemic. We're still in a pandemic, but so basically, I think one of the biggest things that happened is the news from Shop came out about their unionizing efforts that gave us some more information that this could happen in our office and in the field at large. And one of the organizers, Jay, who was actually laid off during that effort for whatever reason, actually and was hired from our office, and she was a big factor because when she came to the office, like we were able to talk about what happened at Shop with her, and she had a lot of resources as to how to start talking and organizing. And through her, we were able to get connected with David and Andrew through the Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers United. And honestly, that was huge because we didn't, like, honestly, we don't know. I don't know how we would have navigated it without them. And I think that is a big factor of how anyone who's trying to unionize, where they should start, because that is like the threshold. Like, sure, there's a lot of information about wanting to unionize, but I think the actual actionable part of it was hard for us, or for me personally, to like grasp without their help. So after we met with David, we talked about to our other colleagues and started organizing, trying to gauge who was interested in unionizing, and we were trying to figure out if we had a majority support with our colleagues. So we talked to our coworkers about that, and then once we did have majority support, we signed the union cards to demonstrate that we had majority support in the office. And when that happened, we were able to ask the office for voluntary recognition. And after we asked for the voluntary recognition, there was some back and forth for a few months about what it really means. What does it mean to be a union? What are the consequences? What is it? Which are fair questions because this is uncharted territory. And I think that Bernheimer Architecture recognized that a union is a space where employers and employees can talk about employee issues outside of just being internal discussion. There's like it required to get things done. For us, we needed autonomy, and that's what the union provides. And so in the end, we were voluntarily recognized.
Thank you so much, Anne and Chris, for walking us through that process. We're now going to open it up for questions. We have David and Andrew from the Machinists Union, or IAMAW, and they're here to provide answers to any questions you might have about forming a union in the architectural industry. For those who want to remain anonymous, there's in the Q&A function, there is a box you can check. So make sure that box is checked before you ask a question if you want to remain anonymous. And then for those who wish to ask their question verbally, please raise your hand and we will ask you to unmute yourself to ask your question. Okay, we have a couple that just came in. So I'll ask the first one. Okay. I'll ask the first one. Professionals often hear that unions aren't for them. What advice would you give architecture professionals who may have heard something like this?
Andrew, I feel like you should take that. But before we jump into questions, I would just extend that if folks have more questions for Anne or Chris as well, that they're happy to answer questions too.
Yeah, I'm already seeing at least one that I think one of them should answer. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. As Katie said, I'm an architect. I'm licensed in the state of New York. I've practiced in 4 different states. I've worked for large firms, for small firms. I've been an independent contractor. I've taught. I've worked for sole practitioners. I've kind of done it all. And so, and I have a lot of, friends, especially in the writing world. My partner's a writer who, heavily unionized kind of industry. And I didn't really think it was for me either, right? Or for all of us here on this call until, some of my other colleagues started educating me on it. And I started, listening to certain things and reading certain resources. And a lot of those are on the Architectural Workers United website. And having those conversations. And I think one of the biggest things was actually having a space to talk about these issues that are systemic to the industry. And they're things that we, I think, have casually complained about for a really, really long time over drinks and many drinks and meals and all sorts of things. But it's sort of with a laugh, right? And it's always kind of like, oh, I pulled an all-nighter, ha ha ha, right? And there's a kind of awkwardness to that, but it's like, okay, well, it's just fine. It is what it is. And I think understanding that, we are workers, we are labor, and actually making that leap and kind of not thinking of ourselves as precious or different, or because we're creatives or because we can want to own our own business someday, we are not workers. We are, right? We don't control what we do on an everyday basis. Even if we have some control over that, we're ultimately beholden to what people are telling us to do. And that's okay. There's no issue with that. It's actually just understanding that. And in order to have a voice, I think exactly like Anne was saying, in order to have a voice, in order to have a say, in order to have an equal balance of power, the only real way to do it is through unionization. And I think, as Chris was talking about, we did a lot of the same things at SHOP that, were informal, were committees, were this, were that, and made some changes. And I won't discount that, but ultimately, it took really long time and a lot of things didn't happen. And we were always kind of worried about what the response would be. And, if we had a legal measure to have some of those things happen, the conversations would have been different.
Thank you, Andrew. Our next question is, how would you encourage architects who work at firms with a healthy work-life balance to unionize?
Yeah, I think that was the one that I was thinking about for Chris and Ann.
Yeah, I'll jump on that first. I mean, I would describe Bernheimer as in terms of architecture practices, like a really healthy place, prior to unionization, in the sense of like, I mean, it's why I wanted to work there, is because in my interview, that was a kind of selling point, is that we do have a good work-life balance. And I think compared to other architecture firms in New York City, that's true. We had pretty good hours. A lot of people were already members of the lobby. And so, in one way to answer the question, I'd say it's, and one of the reasons why we did this is because it's one of the best places to unionize as a kind of a more labor friendly organization. And we wanted, a lot of ways we wanted to kind of start the ball rolling because we could, right? We kind of felt like we should do this because we think we have a pretty good shot at getting it done. But on the flip side, I think, good in the architecture industry is like pretty bad elsewhere. Especially compared to, like others are saying, unionized professions. I mean, I teach as well, and I'm a union member for multiple positions, and like the clarity I got from pay raises, hours, just things I didn't have to kind of haggle over were, it was just super reassuring, as opposed to being in a non-unionized workplace. You've got to go in one-on-one with your boss, and even if you feel like he's a very friendly, great boss, which is how I would describe Andy, it's still like intimidating to go in one-on-one. You're in the dark, you don't know what other people are making. And so I think there's so many examples of like the benefits that a union brings, that even if you're feeling like, oh, we got a pretty good setting, I think workers deserve a contract. It doesn't matter where you are. you deserve clarity, you deserve a seat at the table, and those are all things that can only happen through a union.
Yeah, just to add on that, I think that a lot of the discussions we talked about had as well as just about uplifting the industry at large. And just because we have a healthy work environment doesn't mean the industry is healthy. And that was one of the largest factors for me personally as well. So that we could start somewhere, and also to demonstrate that giving your employees a voice is not a bad thing. And generally speaking, a union really just provides a structure for employees to talk to your employers without feeling in the survey having retaliation or any sort of issue, like fear of talking to your bosses. And I think that is what the power of the union gives you. So it's not just about the healthy work environment, it's about being able to have an open discussion, and also to hold your employers accountable for the things that you ask for but don't address as well. Because the priority, like people in the architectural industry, like the priorities are always projects, not the workplace. And a union will kind of forces employers to prioritize the things that the employees want as well.
Thanks, Chris and Anne. Our next question is, what are the worker protections that you gain when you begin a unionization effort? It's probably David and Andrew.
Yeah, so even outside of union organizing, anytime that two or more workers get together to address their working conditions, that's federally protected. So on a federal level, they call it concerted activity. So if you're doing a petition, some kind of letter to management over a health and safety issue, whatever it is, it's protected by federal law. On top of that, part of what our job as union organizers is to help groups who are trying to form a union figure out the strategy that's going to get them there in the safest and smartest way possible. So a lot of thought is given into how you actually go about organizing. It's like the opposite of that movie Norma Ray, where like you stand on the table and look at the sign union. You really do want to figure out what is the path that is going to get you the best chances of success, and also mitigate any chance of retaliation from the employer. So there's a legal aspect, there's political support, community support, awareness in the media, and we kind of try to bring all those things to bear to make sure that doesn't happen. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Andrew.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think partially it's a technical question too, right? Of like, what are the actual rights? What are the actual protections? And the answer is there's a lot. And there's a lot of things. Not only do you have rights to organize and to talk about the conditions of your work and kind of all of these things, and that's protected by law, but it's also illegal for your employer to do a lot of things. They can't prohibit you from soliciting for a union. They can't question you about your union support. They can't retaliate against you for concerted activity. They can't threaten to close the workplace, promise or grant promotions. Sorry, I'm reading from a cheat sheet real quick, but there's a lot of things, honestly, that you are protected from individually that are your rights, and that are things your employer can't do. Most employers don't even know those things. So if they do those things, usually it's not necessarily malicious. They just don't know what the laws are. But all of that's, protected. And so, that's where, talking to us, even in a non-committal way, just like, hey, these are your rights. These are what you have available to you. And having people like us go to bat for you when those things come up too.
Yeah, if you're interested, just Google NLRA or National Labor Relations Act, and that's the federal statute that lays out those protections.
Thank you. I think the next question is more directed to Anne and Chris. Can you speak more to the back and forth after attaining voluntary recognition?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question is, can you speak more to the back and forth after attaining voluntary recognition?
I mean, we're still going back and forth right now in terms of the actual work and the things that, obtain a contract, it's still like, I don't know, but this happened like a month ago that we were voluntarily recognized. Everything, we're still having to go through training into how to negotiate a contract and everything. So there's just that kind of back and forth. Mostly it's been celebrations, honestly. Like getting together and celebrating the union. But yeah, it's still in early phases.
And the only thing I'll add is, before the voluntary recognition, there was there was a lot of talk of holding an election, which is not what we wanted. Like through the guidance of the IAW, the simplest path of least resistance is voluntary recognition. I think there was a little bit of lack of clarity, which is understandable. Like Anne said at first, what's the difference between the official election versus voluntary recognition, and some people were pushing for an election in the management side, but ultimately, I think we, through conversations, got some clarity that, this isn't really, the voluntary recognition is just, it's not a like outright support of the union. It's just a recognition of the facts that we have the majority to form the union. At the end of the day, Andy did come around, and as people have seen, has been really, supportive, like unequivocally supportive of the union. But I think before he was ready to do that, he wanted to understand what voluntary recognition meant. And it just really was a sort of explicit, you have the cards, like people have, we have the numbers and we have the majority.
Yeah. And that honestly mostly comes from not understanding what the process is like. And I think we were all pretty ignorant of that without the help of the Aerospace and Machinists United. We didn't know what it was, because in the news they always talk about elections and unions, and that's not always, and that doesn't need to be the situation for forming a union.
Yeah, and I'll just add, post getting that voluntary recognition, kind of the work now is surveying the workplace, trying to figure out what are the priorities, what are the things people actually want to propose at negotiations. We're training the committee, and so we haven't started to sit down with the employer to negotiate, but we're doing all the prep work that goes into it, because once you are officially a union, you basically have to flip that democracy switch, and so everyone gets a say in how this stuff works. And so right now it's just figuring out what are the priorities and then translating that into language in an industry that doesn't have a lot of language to look at. So some of this stuff, we're going to be trying to deal with issues that just haven't been dealt with formally in writing yet. So that's the work that everyone's working on.
And I think that the next question is kind of maybe a natural next question. And since you folks are still in the early stages, I'm going to ask this question more broadly. How does a union operate within a workplace? How are issues expressed to management, and how are those tracked and resolved?
Yeah, I would say each workplace is different. It does have to be democratic, but like each individual workplace has a lot of leeway in how they want to operate and how they want to communicate with management. As long as you're electing your bargaining committee, you're electing your stewards and whatnot. I think each workplace can have a different relationship. I think Chris and Ann, if there's any examples that you want to throw out there to give them a sense of how things look at your firm.
Yeah, I mean, like David said, we just elected the bargaining committee, and Ann and I are both on that. And so that's kind of like the core group of folks who are doing the week to week work of, like David said, creating the survey, keeping in touch with all members of the bargaining unit. Some things we do, I mean, we are borrowing a lot of like how we run architectural projects, just having our agendas, our meeting minutes, kind of keeping track of stuff like that. A lot of the interesting thing too has been kind of balancing people's level of interest and engagement. Some people want to really be involved with all aspects of the union and get all the information. Some people kind of want to just be filled in on a need to know basis. And so that's been a challenging, in a good way, like a challenging thing to kind of figure out how do we communicate? And so we've kind of settled on a pattern of our weekly committee meetings, and then having a once a month like town hall in person, for everyone in the bargaining unit to come and ask questions, get any clarity, on top of the kind of weekly email and WhatsApp communications that go out. So that's what we're trying to really codify all this stuff right now and figure out what's the best way to communicate and how to again get everyone's kind of input when people have varying levels of bandwidth and interest and that sort of thing.
I'm gonna combine the next two questions because they're about kind of union composition. Would are interior designers included or excluded in architectural unions? And then are in an architectural union, what positions count as management?
Yeah, Katie, you read my mind. I was thinking about combining these two. So I think one, for the first part of this, the important thing for us, we chose the term Architectural Workers United, and that came out of the shop campaign. That was something that we labored over quite a bit. Like, what do we call this? Is it just us, a union at shop? Is this a larger movement? Is this a campaign? Like, what are we really talking about? But the name was super important, not just for us as the group there, but thinking about the whole point of this is to be as inclusive as possible and to recognize that, people that are designing the built environment are under very similar conditions, right? And so for us at architecture firms, that meant architects, that meant designers that are not licensed, that were trained as architects. That meant people that are doing renderings, people that are building models. That meant landscape architects at other firms, whether architecture specific or not. That meant interior designers and interior architects and lighting designers and planners and historic preservationists and kind of all of these people that work on the built environment. That was important to us. So while every workplace is going to be a little bit different on this, and you can parse it lots of different ways, our thought was have a big umbrella, right? And have a big tent and kind of include people that want to be included, right? And there's a lot of other technical things in terms of like professional versus non-professional and things like that kind of confuse the issue. But the point is, we want the biggest group possible that represents all of the workers at this workplace that are ultimately under the same conditions. So that was huge for us. In terms of how do we think about management, first of all, it's complicated, right? Like the NLRA that David was referencing, that was written in 1935 and frankly has not been updated or has been updated in a way that has, taken away protections from it, if anything. But they sort of use the term supervisory in a lot of ways. So obviously, anyone that owns or has an ownership stake in the firm is going to be out of the bargaining unit, right? That's super clear. Then we talk about people that have privileged information that are sort of confidential employees. And usually this is like people that are doing legal stuff, accounting, HR, sometimes some executive assistants and people like that. Generally, all of those people that are privy to all of that information are out. Kind of lower level workers that are doing administrative work, that's different. They can most likely be included. But then you get to this term of supervisor, right? And again, you have to think in 1935 terms and think about who generally was in unions at that time. And it's mostly manufacturing and, and things like that and production. And so when you think of a supervisor, you think of like one person from like, the top of the building looking down at 100 workers, right? Or 5 for 1,000 or something like that. That's obviously not how we operate in an architecture or landscape or interior office or planning office. We think of our supervisors as like our project architects or project managers, right? But ultimately they're workers too, right? And if they're not making, our sort of read right now is that you are not supervisory unless you are making business or office related decisions on an everyday basis and doing that independently, because and the NLRA lists, 13 different criteria that you have to meet in order to be, or you have to meet one of the 13 criteria to be considered supervisory. And again, it's always about independent thinking and working, and that like people basically aren't like vetoing your decision making. So when we really think about that in terms of architecture, we're thinking, or like a typical architecture office, you're thinking like associate principals, principals who are not partners, directors, those kinds of titles. That's where the kind of gray line is. But ultimately, I think David kind of alluded to this, like every workplace is different. Every single group that we're working with has drawn a different line. And part of that is because the titles are not clear from office to office, right? So we've had a lot of talk about what that really means with each. And ultimately it comes down, like we can have a conversation with our legal advisors and inform that decision pretty clearly. And also, sometimes it's like, oh, you have 10 directors or 5 associates or whatever it is. And maybe 2 of them meet the criteria and 3 of them don't. And that can be parsed as well.
Thank you, Andrew. So I'm gonna, the next question is kind of long, so I'm gonna paraphrase it. This concerns folks on guest worker visas. What was the reaction or response from workers at Bernheimer and Shop who were on work visas, since they may be more vulnerable due to their visa being tied to their job?
Yeah, this is a really huge issue in the industry and a really good question. Andrew, I wonder if you want to jump on this first and kind of give your experience and then maybe talk about just cause and stuff like that too.
Yeah, sure. Anne, sorry.
Oh, I'm not sure. Well, I was just gonna say, I am actually a visa worker, and I'm sure Andrew could speak more to this, but during the organizing process, like the majority of people the majority of us remained anonymous until we had to present ourselves as a union. So that was a way that we protected visa workers in the process.
Yeah, I think part of it's a tricky situation because you have that double precarity of being on a work visa where your ability to be here is tied to your employer, and so it's really an individual decision. But in a typical labor contract, you'll have something called just cause, which basically means the employer the burden of proof is on them if they want to separate you from your employment. Without a union, your employees at will, you can be let go at any time. Once you have just cause and you are a visa worker, you are eliminating a whole section of that precarity because you now know that unless the employer can establish that I am being insubordinate, not performing up to expectations, and has to legally prove that before they can terminate me, it completely changes the situation. I don't know if you want to speak a little bit about some of the folks at Shop and how that played out there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways to handle this, and I think the way Anne mentioned it is great. And I think ultimately, this comes back to a point that we make a lot, both for ourselves, but also everybody that we talk to, is that you can't assume you understand where people are coming from. You have to hear it from them directly, and you have to meet them on their own terms, right? And so if people are supportive, but they have a certain precarity or fear, you have to understand that and accept that and kind of allow that to exist. And also, for visa workers, I think in particular, if they're getting legal advice to not participate or to not sign, I think you have to respect that, right? And not pressure people. And I think that's really, really important to the process. And I think it also, for me, it actually puts the burden in a positive way. It puts the burden on people that have the protections already, right? That are citizens, that are permanent residents, that can speak up and actually kind of lift that bar for other people that maybe don't. And I think we also went about this in a way that we have lots of different firewalls of kind of anonymity and kind of privacy. So, we would do certain meetings that were visa workers only so that they could feel a little more secure in that it's the same population, right? We did ones that were if visa workers wanted to attend, but we did anonymous for them. We did fully anonymous meetings sometimes. We, for people that were like, I would sign a card, but I can't, do anything else? Is there any way that we can protect that information even more than it already is in terms of anonymizing it? And we did that. So I think, again, it's really understanding where people are coming from and trying to meet them on those terms.
Thanks. So we have a lot of questions that have come in. We may not get to every single one of them by 2 p.m. Eastern. So we'll announce at the end both David and Andrew's email address, as well as a DPE email address that you can reach out to if you have questions. But I'm going to go on to the next question, which is a technical question about unionizing. Does every firm need to unionize separately, or is there an opportunity for architectural workers across the industry to be in one union?
Sure, I'll take it. So the way labor law is written in the United States, each workplace has to form their own union. Now, if you were to get to a place where, let's say, 60, 70, 80% of all private sector architecture firms were unionized, you could try to negotiate an industry-wide contract, which is similar to what you see in the entertainment industry, but they still, because they've been organized since like the 30s and 40s, they got to that place because they had such high union density that they were able to convince all the employers that they should come to the table together as one group and just have the whole industry negotiate. So short answer is each individual workplace has to make that decision to organize. If enough places organize, then there is the possibility of industry-wide contracts.
Great. So the next question is about it's again about workplaces that have reasonable workplace policies. Can folks talk a little bit more about why, again, like why you might need a union to get benefits that you don't already have, like how a union gives you an advantage at workplaces that are more reasonable than others.
Yeah, I think the most basic way to look at it is when you become a union, the real difference is you're just gaining access to a set of rights that you don't have right now. When you're not a union, the employer has no obligation to negotiate with you. So anything you're negotiating for, you're really just asking because they can just say no and not engage in the actual negotiation. When you have a union, the employer is legally obligated by federal law to sit down and negotiate with you. You have the right to information, so you can do information requests about what are the actual salaries and pay and benefits, and can kind of look behind that black box and not just have to take the word of your employer, whether they can afford something or not. So you just don't have those legal rights without a union, and then how you use those rights is really up to you. And then if other folks want to jump in more specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I would, that's totally great. I would also kind of on an aspirational level, I think, it also, it just brings real democratic decision-making to the workplace in a way that isn't there in non-unionized firms. And so I think kind of like what I was talking about before with negotiating, for example, with your boss one-on-one. I mean, that across all the issues that you might want to voice or see as a change, someone like me who's a white man is a lot more comfortable probably sitting down with Andy and because of just the misogyny and all sorts of problems in the profession, like it's a lot easier for me to sit down with Andy and talk with him one-on-one than a lot of people at the office. And I think what tends to happen is, the squeakiest wheels kind of get what works for them, while there's a lot of people who just aren't comfortable without organization, voicing their concerns or bringing up issues. And I think that, an example of this is we had conversation before the union about vacation days. And so what a couple of more senior people were like, oh, let's just have unlimited PTO, and like it sounds great in theory, the problem is the people who are comfortable taking as many days as they want are generally more senior, been around longer, closer to management, whereas a lot of our younger staff who are women or people of color often would, just, and this is from conversations I've had with people, don't feel as comfortable like taking more days off, right, without that being codified. And so I think the union is a really, it's just a way to like create a democratic structure in which people know the rights that they have, and there's clarity, right? There's just clarity all around of like, okay, I know I can take this X amount of vacation days, and I know we all have that right, and it's not, I won't look down upon, like, or I won't look like I'm not working as hard as others. And so I think that generally for me has been like one of the greatest things, is to see people just come to the table and really have their voices heard in a way that hasn't happened before.
Since we, only have 4 minutes left in the program, we're typing some responses to some of the more technical questions. I'm going to ask some of the questions on topics we haven't already got to. Next question I'll ask is, how do we raise the value of our work as a profession so that clients will pay higher fees to support our higher wages? The way that firms compete and undercut each other seems to be a large issue here.
Do you want to take that one, Andrew?
Sorry, I was typing. We're talking about.
We're talking about like higher fees and how like attractiveness to clients after organizing.
Yeah, I mean, so the whole race to the bottom, right? I think it's important to understand in a lot of ways where that comes from. It comes from the two antitrust cases against the AIA in 1972 and 1990 that have established the AIA's recommendations to all architects on how to deal with fees and fee structures and how to talk about them between firms. And it's an incredibly conservative read, and they basically affect all other professions, but other professions don't read it this way. So basically, two firm owners can't talk about fees, or else it's collusion. And that is absurd, right? So, but what is exempt from antitrust law is organized labor and unions. So we can actually raise the standards from the ground up. To be clear, your first contract is not going to double your salary overnight. It might not even have huge increases in salary. So it's not really going to affect your fees that much, because ultimately you get the right to information, which means that you get to learn some of these things. And I think that was one of the questions about salaries, about benefits, about firm financials, so that you can make sustainable proposals and put those on the table in a reasonable fashion, because you don't want to bankrupt the firm or make the firm uncompetitive, because that shoehorn or that kneecaps you, right, as workers. And that's not what we're interested in. What we're interested in is a more sustainable business that benefits everybody.
Yeah, and I think this was the question when the first architectural workers reached out to us. This was the question we asked. Like, there's obviously industry-wide issues here that are related to this bid-based industry. And so how do you gain leverage, right? That's the question we're asking. The building trades have leverage because they're organized. The developers have leverage because they have the money. The politicians are making the rules, so they have some leverage. The only group that doesn't have any leverage or a say in the building and construction industry is the people who design the stuff. And so we think about it in a way of like, not how do you increase the value, because the value is there, is how do you actually gain leverage so that you're at that table and are able to kind of hold the line. I think the first kind of goal is, if you can be forced to work an unlimited number of hours because it doesn't cost extra, then you're never going to raise that standard. So I think you have to start at some point that says there has to be a cost to our work. And again, like Andrew alluded to, you can't get there overnight, but if you don't have a floor, then you're never going to increase that value, because you're the part that's fungible. No one else is fungible, right? But you guys are, because you don't have that floor yet.
We're just about at time, so I apologize to folks whose questions we didn't get to. I saw some about right to work laws, about job security, which just caused figures in and some layoff protections. I would definitely encourage you to reach out to David and Andrew with your questions as well. And you can also reach out to us at DPE, where our general mailbox is info@dpe.aflcio.org, which we regularly check. I thank you so much to our panelists and then everyone who attended. I think this was a great discussion, and we look forward to what's next in the architectural industry.
Yeah, and Katie, if you can send us the questions, maybe we'll throw some on the Instagram page and answer them individually that way, or on the website.
Yeah, definitely. We'll do that. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah,
Really
have a
appreciate
good
it.
weekend.